Good evening and welcome to the latest episode of Jacobin's Stay at Home series. I'm Ronan Burtonshaw, the editor of Tribune, and tonight we're going to be speaking to the author Wendy Liu. But just before we go into that, a bit of information about what's coming up in the Jacobin Stay at Home series. On Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, we have Adolph Reed discussing the myth of class reductionism. And on Friday, again at 6 p.m. Eastern, Jonah Birch on the history of social democracy and why socialists believe we need to go further. Before we go further ourselves, I'd ask you all, if you're watching us on YouTube, to like the video, to subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, and to remember to comment for the Q&A session that's coming up after this. If you're watching on Facebook, same deal. Share the video, like the video, comment underneath for the Q&A session. So tonight's stay-at-home series, provocatively titled Abolish Silicon Valley, is about the question of big tech and its power in society. Wendy Liu, who is joining us and will be on shortly, is the author of a new book entitled Abolish Silicon Valley, which traces her journey from a tech whiz kid who may or may not have been illegally harvesting data in pursuit of advertising millions, to disillusionment and ultimately to radical politics through her exposure to and experience of the world of Silicon Valley and of big tech. Wendy describes the process that brought her into wanting to pursue a career in tech, looking for what she called a higher plane of existence, a kind of immortality, the pursuit that I think a lot of people who are interested in advancing human knowledge over generations through the sciences would recognize, a kind of purpose not only for herself, but a social purpose, and getting disillusioned by the reality of what Silicon Valley actually produces. Technological advances which fill the pockets of the super rich and stroke the ego of narcissists with no greater social mission. Through her book and through her writing more generally, Wendy Liu, I think, brings forward a very socialist idea of the role that technology plays in society, that it is a function, that it could serve a greater purpose, but that under capitalism, it's unlikely to do so. Technology, as Marx himself wrote, lays bare the mode of formation of social relations and the mental conceptions that flow from them. So tonight we will be discussing technology, its role in those social formations, the mental conceptions and propaganda which surround the Silicon Valley myth, and what we might do to produce a technological development which more directly serves human need. And with that, I will hand over to Wendy Liu.
Thanks, Ronan, and thanks to Cale Brooks for doing all the work behind the scenes to make this happen. So to kind of give some context on the perspective that I wrote my book from and that I'll be speaking from, I'm pretty new to the left. The entirety of my interest in anything vaguely resembling leftist politics has bloomed over the last 3.5 years. And it's not something that I would have expected before that. 6 years ago, I had just founded a technology startup. I was the CTO. I was really excited about it. My political views were already kind of like right-leaning just through this early entanglement with Ayn Rand and Paul Graham and like that sort of thing. And my political views had solidified in the crucible of an ascendant tech industry, which meant that it was inflected with this idea of meritocracy, of efficiency, of how inequality was good because you're creating all this wealth. And at the time, Silicon Valley was just making so much money. And everyone said that it was making the world a better place. And so I didn't really see any challenges to that. And so it kind of made sense for me to put my faith in Silicon Valley and what it meant, what it said about like where the world was going. And so I really believed that Silicon Valley was the future. And anyone who kind of rejected it they just didn't know what was going on. They were part of they just kind of lost the plot. So I didn't really understand why anyone would critique the tech industry. So that's all very new to me. For a while, my heroes were tech billionaires, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, even Elizabeth Holmes for a while before she fell from grace. And all I really wanted to do with my life was just to make some waves in the industry and, of course, make a lot of money in the process. And it wasn't that I was entirely bereft of morals or anything. I wanted to be a good person. It was more that I thought that all that I needed to do to be a good person was to succeed as an individual by climbing the career ladder and, starting a company, making money, and maybe voting for Democrats every few years. That was kind of like what I saw as politics, just going to the ballot box. And that all came crashing down sometime around the time of that disastrous presidential election in 2016. And what happened is that I started to pay attention to the world around me. And specifically, I started to see just how bad things were for so many people outside my little tech bubble. The more I paid attention to that, and the more I started to question my previous beliefs about how the world worked and what my role should be within it. Because the morality of this idea I'd had before of focusing on individual success, that depended on the world being mostly fair and just, right? And once I started to realize that actually the world is not fair, it's not just, things are pretty messed up, it felt really selfish and just kind of stupid to be thinking about my individual success and just to be, trying to be a millionaire by 25 or whatever it was. I started to think, okay, maybe there are more important things I should be thinking about and doing with my life, things like overthrowing capitalism. So I've had to unlearn a lot of stuff in the last few years. It was this pretty weird and kind of traumatic process of questioning my assumptions around the world and trying to figure out, piece together a new way of seeing the world based on stuff I had never really paid attention to before. And Jacobin actually was instrumental in this process. I remember in December 2017, Verso had this sale. It was like their New Year sale. At the time, I didn't realize that they had a sale like every month. And I thought it was like this amazing thing. And I bought a bunch of books from the Jacobin series, Four Futures, New Profits of Capital, and a couple of others. And I remember these books just blew my mind because I had been having doubts about the kind of liberal framework I'd internalized, but I just didn't really know where to look to develop those doubts. I didn't understand that there was a left beyond liberalism. But then when I started reading Jacobin books and Jacobin articles and, all these other leftist authors, I felt like they were articulating things that I'd been kind of thinking about, but I just didn't have the words for. And it was such relief to realize that not only did other people share those doubts, but that those doubts came out of a broader movement with a shared vocabulary, a long history, and a whole array of institutions. And yes, a fair bit of infighting and disagreement and, its own share of problems, but at the same time, it was transformative just to know that I wasn't alone in thinking this way, to feel like there was a bigger political movement going on, which acknowledged the moral decay that I saw in modern day capitalism and moreover sought to overcome it. So I started reading more leftist books, started going to events. I also did a master's degree in inequality around this time. And at the same time, I was keeping an eye on what was going on in the tech industry, which, by the way, was getting more and more depraved and awful with each passing day. And ultimately, I kind of pieced together this particular conclusion, like a way of seeing the tech industry. And so the way I see it now is the problems in the tech industry are rooted in the broader socioeconomic system. And in a way, that's like a very obvious statement. But for me, seeing the world that way was just super novel. I had never really put together the links between, the problems I was seeing in the economy with the wealth in the tech industry and the question of where does that money come from? Who needs to be poor so that Jeff Bezos can be wealthy? That had never really occurred to me before. But once I kind of discovered the left, it all started to make sense and I couldn't really unsee it. So in other words, another way of saying it is that the wastefulness, the greed, the self-delusion that we see in the tech industry, that is all connected to the larger workings of capitalism. It speaks to an excess of capital sloshing around the system, trying to make a return, while at the same time you have like a fairly weak labor movement. And so capital is able to exert its power in all sorts of novel ways. And, of course, this manifests in different ways. I'm kind of generalizing here. And when I talk about Silicon Valley, I'm mostly talking about like the US and for-profit venture capital-based tech industries in the tech companies in the US. And it's, not quite the same everywhere. But I still think, broadly, it's useful to think of the tech industry as this arm of capital where you have technology that is developed to serve the interests of the ruling class. And, under capitalism, what that means is we have technology predominantly developed to serve the interests of capital. And even though you have individual startups that say they're disrupting a particular segment of capital, like you might have a financial technology company saying, I'm going to disrupt Wall Street or whatever, these companies, even if they're disrupting individual segments, they're not disrupting capital as such. They're not about challenging the power structures so much as they are trying to, displace the currently powerful in order to take their place. So I guess the question next is, how do they do that? Why is technology so lucrative? How are these companies able to make so much money? And the way I would describe it broadly is that these companies capitalize on some technology. They take advantage of technology that either they develop in-house or has been developed elsewhere. And that technology lets them kind of put a stake in the ground when it comes to, I don't know, a new paradigm, a gateway or something. And then they scale that up in a way that allows them to monopolize that gateway. So then because they own the IP, no one can really compete with them. They have the algorithms, sometimes they have the patents, they have the data sets, and they have the brand, which is an important part. Like Google, the company, is the only one who can own google.com because they have that brand. And, the brand is actually like a huge part of what it is. Like we use the word Google all the time, that the company that owns that, it, therefore has something that's quite intangible, but also quite valuable, which is something we don't always think about. And because of that, these companies are very difficult to replace. So the ways that tech companies have been replaced or superseded in the past is when, consumer preferences change for some reason, or there's a paradigm shift in technology, or the government steps in. And the government, in America at least, is just pretty reluctant to step in a meaningful way. And so what this means is that tech companies are able to just become incredibly lucrative, incredibly powerful. They get to the point, once they get big enough, they're able to just buy up any other companies that might challenge them. And so they maintain their position. But then, where specifically do these companies get their profits from? And I think when it comes to that question, it's useful to identify the relationship between a tech company and, the rest of the economy. And so at the risk of oversimplifying things, I would say that we can split modern day capitalism into the realm of production and the realm of consumption, just for understanding where tech companies get their money. And so when I talk about production, I mean the creation of actual things that people will pay for: food, clothes, books, movies, whatever. This is pretty established. Marx wrote a whole book about it. I think we all understand that, hopefully. The consumption bit is a little weird. It's a little more new. And with this, I'm referring to the apparatuses that have developed to ensure that people want and are able to access those things that are created, through production. And so that means, streamlining advertising, or letting people pay for things, or like ship things or whatever. And this is something that maybe is like a little harder to wrap your head around, because it's not quite the same as, producing like a physical product, but at the same time, it's where a lot of tech companies get their money. And so it's important to think about that. And this isn't a perfect typology, but I do think it helps us understand where tech companies are able to make their money from and how they're able to maintain their dominance. And so in the realm of consumption, we have companies like Google, Facebook, Snap, which makes Snapchat. And these companies, they get money through advertising, right? And that's in the realm of consumption. That's not actually they're not making money through producing physical things so much as they are making money through encouraging people to consume physical things elsewhere. And we also have a lot of financial services companies, like financial technology companies, Stripe, Square, Monzo, PayPal, basically companies that let you like pay for things more easily. We also have companies that let you pay for purchases in installments, and also companies that automate the process of debt collection. As awful as that sounds, but that's, like a way that tech companies can make money in the sphere of consumption. But then let's talk about like the realm of production, because I think that's where the immorality of these business models feels more obvious. So in the realm of production, how do you make money? Well, like the way capitalists have made money throughout history, you do that by driving down labor costs, you extract surplus value. And there are a lot of ways of doing this, and there's some that feel a little more benevolent than others. One way is to actually produce, technological efficiency gains. You can automate away a boring process, and that means, the worker is able to get more done and with their time, and everyone's happy. But that's not necessarily the most lucrative or easy way to make money. Usually, the way you make money through in the realm of production is you make work more and more miserable. You apply Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management. You de-skill jobs. You increase the amount of surveillance that's going on in the workplace. You force people to work longer hours. You take away any opportunity for, a break or creativity. You hire the most expensive lawyers to find loopholes in labor law, so you don't have to pay workers benefits or a decent wage. You just say they're independent contractors. All sorts of creative ways to essentially make workers' lives on the job less fulfilling, less autonomous, and just overall like more shitty. And the gig economy companies like Uber, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, whatever, they're all pretty notorious for that. They start out with this promise of making some sort of efficiency gains, but really what they're doing is they are taking away workers' control over their lives, and they're making their work more miserable in the process. Amazon's another good example of this. Amazon warehouses are notorious for just Amazon trying to quantify every single second of the job. And same with, a company like Apple, where they have astronomical profits. And where are those profits really from? You can say they're partly from the software they produce, but it's also from underpaying the people who physically assemble their products, as well as not paying the full ecological costs for all the materials that are extracted from the earth and later turned into devices. More in this kind of realm of production, you have a whole cottage industry of startups that are basically like worker immiseration as a service. You have workplace surveillance startups, you have call center automation startups, HR software startups that basically help you outsource jobs to countries with lower wages. All of these things taking advantage of an atomized and weakened labor movement to enhance exploitation in order to augment profits. Just, really, really lovely, really just making the world a better place. Anyway, this is a bit crude. It doesn't take into account tech companies profiting from, the surveillance state or anything. But I think broadly speaking, it's useful as a reminder that these companies are not making money out of thin air. They are instead profiting parasitically off of the relationships that characterize modern day capitalism. And modern day capitalism is pretty brutal for a great number of people, which is something that you can forget if you read the press releases of these tech companies. They do a great job in concealing just how brutal capitalism is. But anyway, I think once you start analyzing the connections between tech and the rest of the economy, you start to see that the people in positions of power, even though they talk a big game about changing the world or saving humanity and making the world a better place, they don't actually care about humanity as such, right? Like they want credit. They want the credit for having helped humanity, but they don't ever actually want to be accountable to the people they are ostensibly serving. They want to make the world a better place on their own terms without any sort of challenge or criticism from the unruly masses. They want power without the responsibility, and they really think that they deserve it. And in a sense, you can't even really blame them. This is like this is the natural ideology you would expect for those on top, the people who've been sheltered in this position of privilege, isolated from everyone else, people who've gotten disgustingly rich at a really young age and expect everyone to worship them for it. It's kind of like you almost feel bad for them that they're trapped in this little bubble where they really believe their own myths. By the same time, it doesn't mean that everyone else should just roll over and take it. And so one of the things I'm trying to do with my book is to get people to see that, or at least get people to believe that there is a way out, that it doesn't have to be like this forever. The book was published with Repeater Books, and part of the reason I went with Repeater Books as a publisher is because I was very heavily influenced by Mark Fisher's writing, and Mark Fisher is one of the founders of Repeater. And Mark Fisher is probably most famous for his book on capitalist realism, where he really he wants us to believe that there is a world outside of capitalism and that we should be able to imagine a world where things are not just miserable and made more and more miserable by the power structures that currently exist, that there is a way of imagining relations between people that isn't encroached on by greed and capital and market forces. And it's like a kind of a weird hypothesis. And I'm sure that people will read it and be like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this is clearly inefficient and whatever. But, it's a different paradigm. It's a call for just like a different value system and a different way of living in the world and approaching each other as human beings. And so I think, when I talk about abolishing Silicon Valley, I'm not saying we need to make better tech companies, or we need to make them more inclusive, or have just like slightly better companies. I'm talking about something broader and more systemic and a little more hazy, a little more nebulous, which is that we just need a different political terrain, because Silicon Valley became this monstrous force that it did because of the kind of broader political economic landscape in which it grew. And that is what needs to change, I think. I think we need politics. We need to reshape the political terrain into one that's more about ordinary people and not just making rich people even richer. And I think the really nefarious thing about Silicon Valley is that the people in it like to pretend that they're above politics, that they're in this weird, apolitical terrain that is this like, castle in the sky above the messiness of politics. Instead, it's like some heavenly promised land where you don't have to worry about politics. We can just build things. And, there's no such thing as like no problems are insolvable. You just need some really smart people who went to Harvard or MIT or Stanford, and they'll just figure out how to solve any problem. I think that's incredible. I don't know. Maybe people actually believe it. I don't know. But I think it's just incredibly naive, because there's always politics, right? Like, the politics is just about reconciling different perspectives on how the world should be. And you can't escape that. If you say you're above it, then it just means you're, kind of taking the status quo. And right now we live in a highly stratified society. We live in a class society. There is a growing divide between people who have enormous amounts of power over others and the people who are subject to that power, which means they lack any meaningful sense of self-determination. And the way to challenge that is through a mass movement. There has to be power built from below to challenge the power concentrated at the top. We need to dethrone, these kings who call themselves entrepreneurs and VCs. And as for how that's done, I'm kind of open to lots of possibilities. I think it might involve fighting on new terrains. It might involve mobilizing users of technology, or mobilizing, citizens against tech companies that are like trying to take over their city, like in the case of Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. But I think it'll definitely involve familiar battlefields like labor, because capitalism as a mode of production relies on labor power. It relies on workers going to work to create the products that capitalists indirectly rely on to continue accumulating capital. That's the source of their power. And so I think because of that, the labor movement is a very powerful point of leverage under capitalism. It's not the only one, but it's the one where I personally draw the most inspiration from. And it's a little hard to talk about labor in the tech industry because there are people in the tech industry who are in kind of like a contradictory location when it comes to, are they a worker? What kind of worker are they? It's tricky. Ben Tarnoff of Logic magazine wrote a great essay about this called The Making of the Tech Worker Movement, which I'd highly recommend. And if there are questions about this, I can talk about it more. But I think overall, the goal should be a strengthened and powerful labor movement that's fighting for everyone, that's fighting for a better world, one that is actually responsive to the needs of ordinary people and, not just a few on top. And overall, I think my political perspective is an anti-capitalist one. And that's because I think, we got to look at the broader picture. It's not just about Silicon Valley. It's not just about these tech companies. The problem is capitalism as a whole. It's the system that gave rise to all of these massive discrepancies that allowed these, tech luminaries to gain so much power. And I'm sure there are ways of ameliorating the problem within capitalism. But I think if we want to meaningfully tackle the problems of Silicon Valley, we're going to have a substantive critique of capitalism as a whole. And I think in the long run, the goal should be to overcome capitalism, like whatever that means to you. The way I think about capitalism is it's, to use a software analogy, it's a legacy system. It's an antiquated system. We can do better. We have to do better. I think doing better is a good goal to have. It's certainly much more meaningful to me than, trying to start another startup and raise a ton of money. And ultimately for me, the goal is self-determination. You can call that worker control of the means of production. You can call that economic democracy, call it whatever you want. But I think it means people having more control over their lives in a way that's really not possible right now, given the current political economy. It's not possible because we've given all this control over natural resources, over the technology infrastructure, over the things people need just to survive. We've given all of that over to a very small number of people who are not doing everything they can in their power to actually be accountable to the people they should be serving. And I think this is awful. This is not the world that most of us want. I think this is like kind of this really weird point that we're stuck in. And it's hard for many of us to see past it and see beyond it. But I think the first step is to, imagine different worlds and start thinking about the just alternative ways we could organize things rather than having to essentially like pay tithes to these tech billionaires every time we want to, buy something or use something. And I think just to kind of like finish, I think, if we look around the world today, under this coronavirus pandemic, look at who's getting wealthy, look at who's suffering. The question we should be asking is this moral? Not, is this efficient? Not, is this just like the easiest way things could go? The question should be to like take a step back, go back to first principles. What is the goal of our socioeconomic system? What are we trying to do? And if it's not moral, then what can we change to ensure that it is? And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy. We're just about to go into the Q&A session, but before we do, it's time for you all to pay your tributes to the tech gods. Go and like this video if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel. If you're on Facebook, share this video, like the video, and in all cases, make sure to comment. I've been picking up some of your questions on the side here. Also, it's time to remind you that coming up after this on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, we have Adolf Reed of the Stay at Home series, and on Friday we have Jonah Birch discussing A Brief History of Social Democracy. But before any of that, some questions for Wendy Liu. The first one that strikes me, Wendy, when you were talking about this and in your book in general, you talk about how you came to see the problems in the tech industry as symptoms of problems in society. Now, there's been a trend on the left in recent years, a number of books from different authors and different perspectives that seem to lean towards a kind of tech solutionism, or the other way around to almost what you were saying, insofar as using technology to solve the problems of society without necessarily coming through class struggle. I think of like the post-capitalist thesis of Paul Mason, for instance, as being one that gained a lot of popularity. What's your view on the relationship between technology, class struggle, and overcoming capitalism?
Great question. Yeah, I read Paul Mason's book maybe like October 2017 or something, and maybe sometime around like in the early days of just like learning about politics, and I thought it was really interesting. I think my views have changed since then, and I've now recognized the importance of class struggle. I think there's something beautiful in the thesis of post-capitalism, which is that the technology that exists makes it possible to imagine a more utopian post-capitalist world. I still think that's true. The question is, can we get there without changing the relations of power? Because I don't think we can. I think like the technology that exists carries within it the seeds of many different possibilities, and the one that blooms will depend very much on political struggles. I don't think we're going to get a world where all of the books and movies and content we consume is free at the point of use and that its creators are fairly paid without larger political battles. Because what capitalism does is it kind of creates this structure, and then the tech companies that blossom with it, like that grow within it, they follow the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is one that does not serve emancipatory utopian needs. We're not just going to get like this wonderful post-capitalist utopia if we allow those who are currently in power to stay in power. So yeah, I definitely think, for people who are intrigued by the ideas proposed by like people like Paul Mason and other people theorizing about post-capitalism, I guess I would just say, yeah, that's awesome. How do we get there? What kind of battle specifically do we have to wage to get there? And to understand that, I think it's useful to look at history and to see the kind of battles that people have waged throughout history for things that are pretty similar. And, if you read any labor history, it really just, I think it opens your mind as to what is needed, and like the kind of sometimes violent struggles that are needed to just get even the tiniest modicum of, concessions from capital, because those things aren't just going to be handed out. Like capital is not just going to give things to people for free if it means diminishing its power. It's going to cling on to everything it has. And I think that's going to involve quite a bit of struggle. And I do believe class struggle is a useful way of thinking about it, given how capitalism works today.
That's a nice actually setup for one of the questions Forbidden Shuffler has been asking. I'm going to be using all your handles tonight, comrades, and so this is going to get interesting because you've got some interesting goddamn handles in this comment thread. He asks where you situate your work in the context of left accelerationism.
Tricky question. I find the left accelerationist stuff I've read to be really thought-provoking and really interesting. I was very inspired by Inventing the Future. Alex Williams and Nick Cernick, thought that was great. I think my perspective is a little bit different in that I don't really have like a political background. And so I'm more kind of like cobbling things together as opposed to being maybe committed to a particular discipline. Like I'm interested in accelerationist perspectives. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an accelerationist. But yeah, I think, it's so useful to just like see all of these different political perspectives and then maybe cobble them together and figure out how you can piece them together in a way that corresponds to the world that we see today. So yeah, thanks for that question. I don't know if I have a great answer, but yeah.
Another one that's interesting and that comes up a lot in your work is the question of intellectual property rights. So we've had a number of comments asking about your views on open source your views. So that was from Scott Davis. Just for Hacks asked about your view on decentralizing technology. What would you say is the role of things like, for instance, open source and a fundamentally different intellectual property rights regime in abolishing Silicon Valley?
Yeah, wonderful question. So I actually wrote an essay about the open source software movement for Logic magazine. The essay is called Freedom Isn't Free, and it's in issue 5 of Logic. You can find it online if you just Google Freedom Isn't Free. I fell in love with open source when I was, I don't know, like 12 or 13 or something, like at a pretty young age. And I still believe in it pretty strongly as a more utopian, idealized way of arranging things. But I also recognize that, under capitalism, it's only ever going to be this kind of microcosm. And if we want to remake the lines of power in society so that it's more aligned with the open source movement, then that's like a much bigger challenge. It's not something that we can get just by just by focusing on open source. I think there are these structural limitations that prevent the open source movement from taking off. And that has to do with capitalism and the role of property under capitalism. I don't like the concept of intellectual property. I've always thought it was weird. But I also do recognize that in the system that we have now, it is unfortunately necessary. And so I think the idea of open source and, the idea of the commons, especially when it comes to content and anything creative, I think that's a very beautiful imaginary. It's a nice guiding light to help us think, what do we actually want? We want a world where people can create things and people can share them freely and everyone has access to the knowledge and creative content that humanity has produced. And then the question is how do we have to refashion society so that's possible? Because right now it's not possible, right? Like if creators aren't able to make a living from their work, some of them are just going to starve just because we don't have the political structure to make that happen. And so, I think the open source movement has potential as a kind of gateway to a more radical politics. And I hope that people who like the idea of open source go on to think about, what needs to be done to make this movement like a vehicle to a broader emancipatory politics. Because I think, the problem right now is that the open source software movement is pretty much co-opted by corporations. So much of the funding for these projects just comes from Microsoft or Google or whatever, because who else can fund these things? Who else has power? And it is a shame, but I do think there's something really beautiful in the movement. And it inspired me at a young age. It still inspires me today. And if we're going to carry out the vision, stay true to that vision, then we have to think about how that butts up against the prevailing logic of capitalism, and how do we tackle the relations under capitalism to make the vision of open source more broadly true.
One interesting thing that struck me in reading your work. Sorry, we'll go on there for a second. You lean on Mark Fisher, capitalist realism, and the idea of a kind of impermeable system where people can't imagine alternatives. And yet, at the same time, the whole ideology, the California ideology, the ideology around Silicon Valley is this idea of startups, that things can happen from scratch. And you even say it yourself, that you don't treat any structure as inevitable, that you can recreate the world. Can you talk a bit about the contradiction between, on the one hand, this capitalist realism that you said you saw so clearly, and the ideology which told you can change everything and do it all yourself?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think so. One of the things I try to do with my book is to identify the part of Silicon Valley that I found beautiful and still find kind of beautiful, and that's this thing that you mentioned of looking at a system and trying to disrupt it. Not taking it for granted, reimagining it. Treating it as something that just can be changed. Because I think that is quite beautiful. There's something really amazing and admirable about that. The problem is that Silicon Valley has mostly been using that for pretty banal and awful ends, right? It's about how do I disrupt this thing so I can make my shareholders wealthy while putting all these people out of a job. But the core of it, the essence of that idea is it's beautiful. And I think it's something that inspires a lot of anti-capitalists too, right? This idea of not taking the system for granted, being able to envision alternatives. I think where that goes wrong for startups is that even if the founders in the early days are actually really ambitious, and if they really do think that their startup can change the rules of the game, they don't actually have that much power. If you're a startup, you're accountable to your investors, and maybe your investors don't want you to build something that's actually going to change the world. They want you to build something that's going to make them a lot of money in a couple of years. And you could have the most socially useful startup in the world, but if it's not going to make them a lot of money, they'll say, no, don't do that. Instead, we want you to build branded video experiences or this like enterprise software, like blockchain marketing, whatever, because it comes up against the limitations imposed by this larger system. And so even the most idealistic founders, even the ones who really do want to disrupt something, they're only able to channel that disruptive energy in a direction that is allowed by capitalism, that kind of goes at least somewhat along with the needs of their investors. And what that means is that it's very hard for tech companies to actually disrupt power structures in a way that, decentralizes things and returns power to the people, as opposed to like concentrating it among a wealthy few. And I think there was maybe some people in the early days who really believed that technology would do that. Like they really thought things were going to turn out differently. But of course, what has happened over the last 20 years, we've seen a bunch of tech companies rise up the ranks of the billionaire ranks. And we have companies that are maybe sometimes trillions of dollars, depending on where the stock market is at. We have all these new billionaires. We have this whole industry that's just, it's driven by this pursuit of greed and wealth. And it's really horrible. And, I think this is in a way, it's sad, but it's kind of like the logical endpoint of technology development under capitalism. I don't know if there's something that any individuals could have really done to change it. I think this is just how the structural incentives line up. And so, this idea that the disruption, the really nice bit of Silicon Valley, which is this urge to disrupt and to build something new, I think that's being harnessed to the wrong ends. And it's a shame, because I think there's some people in the industry who actually do want to build something really cool, but it's very hard to do that in a way that's also aligned with social good, because, the prevailing forces just won't allow that. If social good means taking away the power of the powerful aren't going to want that to happen, right? Like it's completely against their interests to allow you to build something that will take away their power. Sometimes they might accidentally do it. Capitalists will sell you the shovel or whatever. But I think broadly speaking, it's really hard to fund something that is, anti-capitalist and to get like venture capital funding to build something to disrupt venture capital. They're not very interested in that for the most part.
You go into tech worker organizing. And this is something I know you personally have been interested in, involved in for some time. You've been speaking about how if the book, had come out a number of years ago, this wouldn't have been in existence. But now it is a thing. It is a phenomenon. You have seen attempts at unionization. You have seen attempts at worker action. Two questions on that. One, Neil Glynn asks, why is union density in the sector so low? And do you think it will grow over time? Do you think it will get higher? And secondly, do you think that it can be the decisive factor in changing Silicon Valley, abolishing Silicon Valley, producing a new technology landscape with a mass organized and militant tech worker union movement?
Yeah, it's a fun question. I think I've personally been very inspired by all the tech worker organizing that's been happening in the industry over the last few years. And by that, I mean everything from, software engineers trying to form a union on their own, or standing in solidarity with other workers and trying to help them form a union or otherwise, bargain for better conditions. Uber drivers, Instacart workers, all of these people who are in the tech industry, who are workers in the tech industry, but may not always be thought of as workers, who are trying to, fight for what they deserve in the industry. And I think if I'd written this book like a couple of years ago, I don't know if I would have had that perspective as much. I think I'm, still kind of learning about this, still gaining this perspective on labor and the importance of labor in crafting pushing for like a more utopian world. So yeah, I think I definitely find the tech worker organizing movement to be incredibly inspiring. The question of density, why is union density so low? Well, I mean, union density is very low in the US in general. And so if we're looking at the US workforces of companies like Google and Facebook, it's like not that surprising that it's low just right off the bat. But then if you look into the specifics of these companies, the way they work is for their most prized jobs, like, software engineer or product manager, whatever, they'll recruit these people straight out of university, give them 6-figure salaries, give them stock, give them pretty good working conditions, tell them to work on whatever they want, give them a lot of freedom, creative control, and autonomy. And when you're in that kind of role, and it's hard to think that you need a union because you feel like you have everything that unions have fought for. Unions are an antiquated thing for, I don't know, coal miners or factory workers or whatever. That's kind of like, that's a very easy thing to believe. And I mean, I've heard other explanations for this where the companies that characterize the tech industry, I mean, they were able to form in a way that kind of like evaded the unions, like escaped union structures that were more present on the East Coast. That seems pretty plausible to me. But I think another way of thinking about this is that all these companies became they arose in an era when the labor movement was already weak, right? And so like, it's not that surprising that they don't really have unions. And these companies are very good at doing whatever it takes to keep their companies union free. That's partly through just paying some of its workers very well, and also through really good PR and, internal PR, making it seem like they're a family, not actually a workplace, and that, you and your boss and your boss's boss all have the same interests, that they give out stock to a lot of their workers. And I think that goes a long way towards making people think they're on the same side, even though obviously, the CEO has a lot more stock than the 1,000th hire or like an intern or something. But yeah, I think the industry is very good at ideology. If the one key innovation of Silicon Valley is just crafting this really great myth about itself that is actually very hard to dispel in any way. Every time you try to challenge it, all these people will come into your mentions and tell you that you're wrong and that Elon Musk will save us. I think it's a very compelling myth to a lot of people. And then as to the question of like, will the union movement grow? I think it will. I don't know, I don't really know what that's going to look like, but I do think that the industry is getting to the point where it's hard to not talk about politics. It's hard not to think about like the political implications of just, not just like the companies themselves and what you're building at any given company, but also the relationship between the massive wealth in the tech industry and the rest of the world. And I think what I find really inspiring about some of the tech worker organizing that's been happening in Silicon Valley is that it's not just about better wages and working conditions for already well-paid software engineers, for example. I think there are a lot of demands about things like equity when it comes to contractors. Contractors at a company like Google who aren't getting paid great wages, don't have good benefits, or don't have job security. And I found it really inspiring that there are a lot of demands about trying to make that more equal and like fighting for not just your own job but for others as well. And there's this effort to just have more worker control over what's actually being produced. Some of the organizing that's been happening over the last few years at companies like Google has come through software engineers not wanting to work with the military, for example, the US military. I mean, not all Googlers are even like American. And it is pretty weird that Google has contracts with the US military. Same with Microsoft, same with a lot of these other companies with ICE and police forces. So yeah, I think what I find really inspiring about the tech worker movement is that it is a way for workers to assert more collective control over the stuff they're building, and through that, indirectly through the kind of world they want to live in. And I do think it's going to grow. I think in a sense, this is just where the trend lines are going. Individual companies and CEOs will do their best to squash it. But I think overall, the situation, even outside the tech company, just like under capitalism more broadly, the situation is pretty awful. And I think more and more people are waking up to it. It's harder to not see it these days. And so once you acknowledge just how immoral and horrible everything is, how like just messed up the world outside our windows is, you can't really go back. And I think there is hopefully going to be a lot more energy among people in the tech industry at all levels of the industry to try to use whatever leverage they have to try to refashion things, to challenge their boss, to make their company more ethical, to ensure that their company pays its contractors better, that Uber drivers and delivery workers and all these other people who make up the wealth in the tech industry, that they're paid much, much better than they are currently now. So
we have a question here from Micah, the Jacobin editor, taking privileges here in the comment section, but it turns out it's a very good one, so I'm going to ask it. He says, what's the ideology of your average non-executive tech worker? Is it still the case that a lot of them, as you kind of describe, are drinking the Ayn Rand Kool-Aid and have these right-wing or libertarian views? Or are they increasingly, like a lot of their generation, sympathetic to the left?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they're definitely a subset of people who are like the Ayn Rand, Elon Musk worshipping sort. Mostly, white men, I guess. I think the industry has been getting much more diverse. There are a lot of people who come from much less privileged backgrounds and who, as a result of that, are more likely to be aware of like what the world is actually like. And yeah, I think it's pretty broad. I do think the industry does whatever it can to inculcate a particular ideology among people. Like, it tries to keep people sheltered. It tries to keep them in this state of like atomization and focused on individual success. It wants people to believe in meritocracy. But I do think that there is a pretty substantial trend of people entering the industry who reject that, who are primed to have anti-capitalist views, who don't like the idea of meritocracy, even if it does exist. And yeah, I think it's definitely changing. And, if you look at who donated to the various presidential candidates in 2016 and 2020, there are a lot of Bernie supporters among software engineers. The local DSA chapter in San Francisco has a lot of people who work at tech companies, and even those who have pretty privileged roles. So I think, yeah, the industry, we have a stereotype of the industry as being this like awful place where it's just these really out of touch, privileged tech workers. But that's never really been true. The industry has always been quite broad, has always attracted a very diverse group of people. And it's also changing as the industry grows. But I do think like we have this stereotype because the people who, for whom that stereotype is true are just very visible, right? Like you think about the billionaires and VCs, founders, whatever, they tend to be pretty awful, and they're the ones the media likes to talk about. So I think that's why we have that image of Silicon Valley as being this really awful place. It's not all bad.
We have some great questions coming in now in the comment threads, so we're going to try and keep this going for another 20 minutes or so if Wendy's willing to stick with us, because there's a lot to get through. In the meantime, I will remind you all that Wendy is the author of a book, Abolish Silicon Valley. You should all go and buy it. In addition to doing your job in subscribing to the Jacobin YouTube, sharing the video if you're on Facebook, and all the rest of it. So we've one interesting subject that keeps coming up, which is the question of the role of Silicon Valley and big tech in the American state apparatus, both at home and abroad. So Spencer asks, how much of an obstacle is the reliance of big tech on big tech by the CIA, FBI, police services in trying to abolish Silicon Valley, because that is obviously very much integrated at the moment. And David Campbell asks about the role of big tech in the military-industrial complex, and which, of course, anyone who's read Mariana Mazzucato's book on the entrepreneurial state will know just how much technology that went into the first iPod came out of research conducted by the military in the United States, effectively, and I think it's more or less the same with DARPA and all these things. So the question is, how important is Silicon Valley in terms of those big state operations in US capitalism, and how much of an obstacle is that then to trying to abolish it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think taking a step back, like what is Silicon Valley? What does that mean? And it's like a weird ambiguous term, because it can mean, companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft. It can mean this whole like industry, or it can mean just more broadly technology used under capitalism. And that's kind of like the way I'm referring to it, which is a little bit weird. And so it's pretty well known by this point that a lot of these big tech companies have links with the military industrial complex. Eric Schmidt, who was CEO of Google for a while and still has like deep links to Google, he was like, there was a whole New York Times piece about him, about how he was trying his best to get more military contracts between Google and just like all of his other companies. And yeah, I think there is definitely a very strong part of the industry that is trying its best to get American tech companies to contract with US military, ICE, whatever, which has a lot of resistance, I would say, from within, from the people who are, the actual workers who are carrying out, like building these programs. So I wouldn't necessarily take that for granted. I think that's been where we've seen some of the biggest gains in the tech worker movement, where you have these workers who are just very adamant about not wanting to work on this kind of technology. So I think that's something where, it's worth keeping an eye on seeing what happens. But yeah, I mean, as for the question of like, how is it possible to abolish Silicon Valley when, Palantir is relied on by the US government, by its most repressive apparatuses? That's a great question. I don't really know. I think it is pretty hard to imagine just how is it possible to take away the power of these companies when there's this like strong thing that's kind of just like keeping them up. I don't know. I think that like in general, any movement to abolish the industry or otherwise just like radically transform it will have to grapple with the repressiveness of the modern surveillance state, and that might make it pretty difficult. And I think that's something that people are talking about in the last like a few weeks with the protests that are going on. And it's very clear that a lot of the tech companies that like to talk about how they're making the world a better place are also working with, police forces and the military. And are they going to be on the side of the protesters, or are they going to be on the side of the police force that will come to beat those protesters up? We'll have to find out. But yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer to that question, but I think it's definitely something. It's like an important point. A lot of these companies are quite deeply entwined, or at least are trying to be deeply entwined with these very repressive apparatuses, and that's pretty scary. And I'm not really sure how to get out of that.
Matthew Collado in the comments asks about the role of Silicon Valley in securing America's position as the global economic hegemon, and how important that is, and whether you think then that this is not just a kind of fight in the United States or whatever, but that it has international implications.
Yeah, there are definitely international implications. There's this one kind of strain of resistance to the tech worker movement, which says that it basically says that workers who are organizing are anti-American because they're preventing, American tech companies from being powerful, and that, they're trying to say tech workers have to be loyal to their company, which means being loyal to their country, because we have to stop China from taking over the world or whatever it is. I think there's definitely some people who are trying really hard to sell that line, that we have to think about national interests first. In the U.S., I think it's stupid, but I'm sure there are people who really strongly believe in that. It's tricky because, like, what the interesting thing about these tech companies is that even as they maybe work with the U.S. military or otherwise bolster U.S. interests, they aren't exactly American, right? And some of them don't even, like, they do their best to keep their money out of the hands of the U.S. government. They create all these shell companies to avoid paying taxes to the U.S. and whatever. They're not quite aligned. In a way, they're this separate, like a tertiary force that's, it's transnational, supranational. I don't know. I'm sure there's a better term for it, but yeah, I think they are in a way a force to themselves. And if we look at, for example, what Facebook was doing with Libra, I mean, they were doing their best to try to create a currency that would supersede the US currency. They didn't want to be, like, initially their plans were just super grandiose and super ambitious. They wanted to do something that was that no individual nation could achieve. And I think a lot of these countries don't necessarily care about national interests. They may say they do, right? When they're trying to get a contract with the US military, they'll say, we really want to make America powerful or whatever. But, like, I think they care about themselves. They care about their companies and their own legacies in a way that may not always be in alliance with, like, the US government, for example. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
Another question which is raised, you obviously wrote recently in The Guardian about Amazon as a public utility and the role that Amazon has played in the economy in the context of coronavirus and so on, but also just its growth into this enormous distribution behemoth, and the fact that it is now doing a job which in any previous era would have been regarded as a public service or public utility. What are the prospects, do you think, of really taking over companies like that, of using tools like nationalization through the state in order to try to produce more progressive technological landscape? And we have David as well in the comments, David Turner, who has asked about the question of worker-owned alternatives. So instead of just focusing on questions like unionization in existing companies, whether or not it is viable for us to imagine kind of worker-owned tech landscape.
Yeah, great question. I think, yes, worker ownership is a really important avenue to explore. But the way I look at tech companies and the question of nationalization is, I think it kind of depends on the company and what it does, and what is its role in the economy? How indispensable is it? How replaceable is it? And then I think the specifics of any individual product or service should inform the policy responses to it. And so in some cases, what you really need is you need some sort of protocol that things can, like, hook up to. Sometimes what you need is just like a straight up public service. Sometimes what you need is, worker owned cooperatives competing with each other. I think it really depends. In the case of Amazon, we should look at its different components, like the discrete components. So Amazon Web Services, that is where Amazon makes a lot of its money. And it's a service that competes with the cloud services departments of a lot of the other companies, like Microsoft's Azure platform, Google Cloud. And yeah, I think that for that, we have to look at that separately from Amazon's retail arm or the other products that it makes. And so I think it is like a tricky question. I don't know if I have like a short answer for that, but overall, I think the approach should be giving more power to workers and having the technology, insofar as it's, intellectual property, having that technology be available more widely, more freely, open source it, make it public domain, something, just like a different way of developing it and distributing it, and having it just instead of having ownership be concentrated among a small number of people. Because I think, like, when you get to the point where this technology is so powerful that it can allow a company to become $1 trillion company. That's the same point where that technology is too powerful to be owned, by this one guy named Jeff Bezos, who has $150 billion or whatever in Amazon stock. Maybe less now that he got divorced. I don't know. I think there's this kind of trade-off we have to make where we can't just analyze ownership of this technology in terms of who created it, like who was the founder or whatever. Like what is the equity breakdown look like of the company? I think when a technology has proven its social utility and it's gone to the point where it's clearly valuable and people are depending on it, then we need to use like a different framework for analyzing it. And maybe the solution will be this technology should be open source. Every municipality should have like its own version and they can customize it, but overall they shouldn't have to reinvent it from scratch. Maybe it means like this could be a worker-owned co-op or something. I think it just completely depends on the situation. But the general framework we should abide by is how do we ensure that the benefits of this technology accrue to everyone, and that you don't restrict it just based on like who can pay for it. Like if a technology is actually useful, it should be available to everybody, free at the point of use ideally, and you find another way to fund it. Ideally, I don't know, progressive taxation, or even just like it is a different way of thinking about how to run things, and not the kind of for-profit startup model that we're used to right now.
Christian Fuchs in the comments asks whether a changed tech landscape could be part of reclaiming entrepreneurship and the idea of what work is. Is that something you would foresee yourself? Because obviously, as you say in the book, you do talk about the positive aspects of Silicon Valley, being those ideas that you can start things up yourself, you can create things. Is it possible that is maintained even as the kind of edifice of Silicon Valley capitalism is torn down?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'm, a big fan of Christian's work. So thank you for listening along and for asking that. In my book, in a chapter near the end, I talk about reclaiming entrepreneurship from capital. And I think what that means is a new model of entrepreneurship that's based on public service as opposed to, personal greed. And so I think it's important to have a positive view of entrepreneurship where the goal is to create this useful product or service that's used by a lot of people, whether or not it makes you wealthy. Like we should have a world where nobody needs to become wealthy just to be able to survive, where, instead of being motivated by the idea of buying like a private jet or whatever, your motivations are about serving the people, like serving your community, serving whoever would want to use your product. And I think that's a very, very valuable idea. And I think there are people in the tech industry now who are doing that and doing the best they can under the circumstances, which are, very difficult because there's not a lot of money for social entrepreneurship. And I think, the little money that there is often has strings attached, and it's very difficult to make something like that work in the current environment. But overall, just in theory, this idea of being able to just be entrepreneurial and build something from scratch in order to serve a lot of people, I think that's great. And that's the kind of energy that we need. We should fashion a world where as many people as possible have the opportunity to be able to do that, because I think it's quite a rewarding thing to be able to serve a lot of people. And, we can have a broader conception of entrepreneurship. It doesn't just have to mean like, I don't know, creating like a blockchain startup. It can be entrepreneurship just to create a small business or something using technology. Like the tech industry has a very particular conception of entrepreneurship that is very shallow, very narrow, and really misleading. And, it makes us think that this 20-year-old Stanford dropout who created a mobile like banking app or whatever is more of an entrepreneur than someone who, I don't know, is like starting a restaurant or whatever. Like that's silly. We need to take back this idea of entrepreneurship from the way that Silicon Valley has twisted it, because I think it is a very useful concept, and we should have a society where people are able to create things in an entrepreneurial way without having to do it in a way that's like, damaging for others or without being motivated by the idea of extreme wealth. Because I think that the motivation, like people being motivated by becoming fabulously wealthy, that just leads to perverse incentives. That's how you get Adam Newman. And I wrote an article for Tribune a few months ago about that, about the way WeWork is kind of symptomatic of like the problems with the Silicon Valley ideology, where, all you have to do is just create something that scales and then you'll become fabulously wealthy and everyone's going to look up to you. I think that just attracts the wrong kind of people, the kind of people who don't actually care about building something that really serves other people, and who are instead just like, how do I fool my investors to giving me a lot of money? And yeah, I don't think we want that.
Fran in the comment section says, I miss Napster, and I totally appreciate that. This is someone else from my own heart, someone from my generation who's weighing in here. Totally correct, Fran. But on a broader point, you raise in your work something else which is close to my heart and relevant. The idea of a socialist media system being part of a new post-Silicon Valley tech framework. As a struggling, jobbing socialist editor of a small publication, can you describe what you were envisaging in that scenario, and why you think it is possible that we could create such a distinct media system by transforming the tech landscape?
Yeah, sure. So to give some context, so I wrote an article for Tribune, I think maybe the third issue or something, about journalism and how, journalism is dying, partly because of companies like Google and Facebook taking away ad revenue, but partly just because it's kind of like a weird business model, and maybe it's, not something that should be thought of as a business. And what I'm proposing, what I would like to see instead, is a system where we think of journalism and just media production in general as a public service, and one that's not paid for necessarily at like the point of consumption, but instead just paid for the way we pay for roads, or the way we, pay for other infrastructure. Because I think it is crucial to having a society that really works for everyone, just having media be accessible to everyone, and that isn't always going to work within the confines of the profit motive. So yeah, I think what we're seeing right now with the way the industry, the way like journalism is just in decline, is they were using this business model, which is mostly, funded on ads, sometimes like subscriptions, that kind of works. It was like fine for a while, but when you have companies like Google and Facebook coming in and taking all their ad revenue, it just doesn't work anymore. And there are, a couple of different ways that we can respond to that. One is to say, well, if we just make Google and Facebook give away some of their money to fund journalism, then things will be better. And it's like, yeah, it would be better than what we have now, but I think we should strive for something better than that, because, Google and Facebook, they're already kind of doing that. They're like putting money aside to fund journalism, which is very sketchy, and we should be very suspicious of that. But I think in general, we should envision a new way of funding these things that is independent of the existing power structures, that doesn't rely on the generosity of, big tech companies, and that doesn't treat the power of companies like Google and Facebook as inevitable and eternal. I think it's, what we want are just like a much richer, broader array of ways of creating and distributing media, where creators can get paid. Like, we should ensure that people who create things are able to survive and are able to like live decent lives, even if they don't necessarily get paid like at the point of consumption. And because, to the point about Napster before, I think what was beautiful about like pirating music and movies and things like that is that people love the idea of getting this stuff for free. But at the same time, there's probably also a thought at the back of their minds, like, well, how is the artist going to get paid? And like, that is a very important thought. And what we should do about that is realize that, yes, we can distribute content, kind of like free with like zero marginal cost, if you just like copying a song or whatever, but that there are costs to producing it. And because of that, we should decouple the point of consumption from the point of production, and ensure that there is like a different system for funding artists and journalists and anyone creating media, while allowing all this stuff to be available for free. Because I think, that sounds to me like just like a much better world, we can think of it as like a library that's open to everyone, where anyone can have access to any content that is created, and the people who create it are able to be, they're able to be funded for it. And there's just so many ways we can like experiment with making that happen. So yeah, I think that's like an imaginary we should hold on to.
A reminder to everybody who's still tuned in here, and there's a great number of you, so thank you all for watching, that Wendy is the author of Abolish Silicon Valley, and you should all go and place your orders for it at some stage, but not using Amazon. So another point I wanted to raise, right? In your book, you talk about how you came to see people as data. You talk about how your entire world was reduced to an understanding of revenue goals without seeing how these things impacted your consumers' lives. What is it that is so particular about tech as an accelerant to the process of alienation, which is inherent to capitalism? Why do you think tech is so good at advancing that process, which is the kind of parable of your story, of your book, of how you personally became alienated by your own work? And it seems to me, something that is very common across the industry with a lot of people who work in it, and also, has to be said, people who consume it.
I think it's partly a function of scale. One of the things that technology is really good at is like letting you scale up really quickly. And when you have, say, a product used by a billion users, then you can really only relate to them in this very, like objectified way. But also, I mean, I think the reason that technology is good at creating this kind of objectification is I think it's partly the broader socioeconomic system, right? Like under capitalism, you have these incentives to objectify your consumers or users or whatever in this way. You have to treat them as like sources of revenue, because if you don't, then you're not very good at your job. Then your competitors will beat you. I think there are these like broader structural forces that create these kind of incentives. Yeah, I know it is pretty sad. And part of what I kind of realized in my, like, part of the reason that I fell out of love with the tech industry is that I realized that it is very hard to do anything but that. It's very hard to see people in more meaningful and rich ways when you're in this kind of industry where you just see like ones and zeros, you just see numbers, you see revenue, you see cost of customer acquisition or whatever. That's just kind of that is just like the paradigm that you're expected to use, and I think it's very alienating. It's very sad, and yeah, I don't think it's necessarily specific to tech. I think you can see that in a lot of other industries as well. But the technology industry is very good at like scaling that up and making that its kind of reason for being, right? It's like the driving force. It's this whole mindset. It's this whole like ideology, and that's pretty unfortunate.
Final question. Thank you all, by the way, for watching and for commenting. We've got fantastic ones in, many of which I haven't been able to go to, and I apologize for that. You can find Wendy on Twitter at Dell System. I suggest you all take to Twitter and bombard her with the questions that I didn't get to ask tonight. But really, thank you very much. It's been really, really good. I've hosted a number of these, and this is by far the best and broadest range of questions that we got. But one that struck me, because I do think it'll be characteristic of a number of people watching tonight, Deep Titanic, asks the question, what can I do as an isolated worker, tech worker, a company that doesn't have a union? What can I do to contribute to a better landscape in tech, to contribute to abolishing Silicon Valley, when I don't have necessarily a context of other people who are pushing the same direction?
Yeah, I'm glad you ended on that question. I don't necessarily have like a great answer to that. I think I'm still trying to figure it out myself. But in general, the things that have that I find inspiring are, if you're a tech worker and you don't have the opportunity to form a union, that doesn't mean that you can't contribute in other ways, right? Like Get involved in activism in your local area, wherever you can. Like, look for groups that are kind of doing this thing, work with them, learn from them. Educate yourself on political ideas, educate yourself on labor history, just get a sense of what people have done in the past and see how that can be applied to the present. I think in general, just like keep an eye out for what's going on and see what you can do. I don't know if I have any better answers than that. I think I'm still trying to figure out like what I personally can do to kind of push things forward. But I don't think that a tech worker should think of their options as limited to unionizing in their current workforce. Because like for a lot of people, that doesn't really feel that productive. It doesn't really feel that possible. Maybe their workforce is one that doesn't have a lot of leverage within capitalism. And so if they do unionize, maybe their boss will fire them or something, as has happened in the past. I think there's a broad range of options beyond just like unionizing your particular workforce. Although, if you can do that, give it a shot, I guess. But in general, like pay attention to are there other activists or other unions in your area that you can get involved in? Are there like broader political struggles? Can you educate yourself, educate your friends? Pay attention to the world, that's happening around you, because I think that's like part of the biggest thing is just paying attention to what's going on and, helping others to see the world the way that you do.
Thank you very much, Wendy. A reminder to everyone still tuned in that Wendy is the author of Abolish Silicon Valley, a new book that's just out. You should all go and make sure you get it. And also that Wendy has written pieces recently in The Guardian on why Amazon is a public utility, written pieces in Tribune on a number of topics, including abolishing Silicon Valley itself. So go read those. This was a stay-at-home episode for Jacobin. On Wednesday, we have the next of the stay-at-home series, 6 p.m. Eastern. We have Adolf Reed on the myth of class reductionism. That is followed on Friday, again at 6 p.m. Eastern, by Jonah Birch on the history of social democracy and why socialists need to go further. And this Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have the next episode of Michael Brooks and Anna Kasparian's YouTube show for Jacobin, so also tune into that. I've been Ron Burtonshaw, the editor of Tribune. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you all again soon.
Mm-hmm.